My name is David Breeden, and I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society. Today I would like to talk a little bit about genetics and what the latest developments in genetics are coming to tell us about how we think and how we behave. I'd first like to share an anecdote from a book called The Nurture Assumption: Why Children Turn Out the Way They Do, Parents Matter Less Than You Think, and Peers Matter More. And the author is Judith Rice Harris. And let me share this anecdote. Donald was 10 months old and Gua 7.5 months when she came to live with the Kellogg's in 1931. Right from the start, she was treated like a human baby. That is, the way human babies were treated in the 1930s. The Kellogg's put clothes on this chimpanzee and the stiff shoes that babies wore in those days. She wasn't caged or tied up, which meant that she had to be watched every second except when she was asleep. But then that was also true of the human baby, Donald. She was potty trained. Her teeth were brushed. She was fed the same foods as Donald and had the same nap times and bath times. There's a photograph in the Kellogg's book of Gua and Donald sitting side by side, dressed identically in footed pajamas of the kind my mother used to call Dr. Denton's. Donald is frowning. Gua's lips are curved upward in a modest smile. They are holding hands. Aside from the difference in temperament recorded in that revealing photo, the two were remarkably well matched. Chimpanzees develop more rapidly in infancy than do humans. But Donald was 2.5 months older, and that helped to even things up. They played together like siblings, chasing each other around the furniture, roughhousing and giggling. Donald had a walker, a big heavy thing, and one of his favorite sports, according to his parents, was to rush at the ape in his rumbling juggernaut and laugh as she scurried to keep away from being run over without much success. But Gua didn't hold grudges, and she enjoyed rough and tumble play. In fact, the two got along better than most siblings. If one of them cried, the other would offer pats or hugs or consolation. If Gua got up from her nap before Donald, she could hardly be kept from the door of his room, the mother wrote. Gua was more fun than a barrow full of Donalds. When the Kellogg's tickled her or swung her around, she would laugh just like a human baby. If they tried swinging Donald, he would cry. Gua was more affectionate, expressing her affection with hugs and kisses, and more cooperative. While being dressed, the chimpanzee, but not the boy, would push her arms into open sleeves and bend her head to allow her bib to be tied on. If she did something wrong and was scolded for it, she would utter plaintive "ooh" cries and throw herself into her scolder's arms, offering a kiss of reconciliation and uttering an audible sigh of relief when she was permitted to bestow it. In mastering the challenges of civilized life, Gua often caught on a little faster than the stolid Donald. She was ahead in obeying spoken commands, learning to feed herself with a spoon, and giving a warning signal when she needed to use the potty. Unfortunately, though, her potty training never became completely reliable. The ape equaled or exceeded the child in most of the tests that Dr. Kellogg devised. She was as adept as Donald at figuring out how to use a hoe-shaped implement to pull a piece of apple toward her, and learned more quickly to use a chair to reach a cookie suspended from the ceiling. When the chair was moved to a new starting point so that it had to be pushed in a different direction to reach the cookie, Donald continued to push it in the same direction as before, whereas Gua kept her eye on the cookie and claimed the prize. There was one thing, however, in which the boy was clearly superior. Donald was the better imitator. Does that surprise you? According to Frans de Waal, a Dutch primatologist who spent several years observing the chimpanzees and their human visitors at the Netherlands Zoo, quote, "Contrary to general belief, humans imitate apes more than the reverse." End quote. Now think for a moment about superheroes. And in the superhero world, it's called an origin story. That is the trauma that led the superhero to become super. Remember poor little Bruce Wayne, who watches helplessly as his parents are murdered. Superman rockets off the planet Krypton, sent away by his parents moments before the planet explodes, only to find himself in Kansas, where a loving couple adopts him and nurtures him with truth, justice, and the American way. Magneto and Professor X start out as just normal mutants, but life experience sends one on to found the good guy X-Men and the other to electrical evil. Perhaps only the shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, but very human folks have to deal with the effects of what other people do, their misdeeds. And very human folks sit on juries in courtrooms where, more and more each day, genetic testing, nature, serves as a mitigating circumstance to violent acts. Clearly, the creators of superheroes believe that nurture trumps nature in that long debate between which is more important, nature or nurture. But the more we know about genetic makeup, the more we have to ask, is that true? Shakespeare has Mark Antony say, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." I think I can call that the origin story defense. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Unlike in Shakespeare's day, not all that many people believe that the stars and their positions at our birth have all that much to do with how we act and what our fate will be. Yet, try this quote. "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our genes, but in ourselves." Do our genes make us do it? Whatever the it might be, our actions. But this statement requires a bit more thought than Mark Antony's original assertion about the stars and fate reveals just how imbued we are nowadays with the equation genes equal actions and genes equal fate. Or evolution made me do it. One reason for this is that genes and our evolution do construct our reality. Science and medical advances due to genetic researching are breathtaking, and we know more and more about how our genetic structures do indeed create our propensity for diseases, for instance, and some other interesting traits because of twin studies and that kind of thing. We discover that some things must be in the genes. You can separate twins at birth, and they get back together 40 years later, and we discover that both of them collect toy trains and that sort of thing. How do those propensities work if they've been raised in completely separate circumstances? So genetic research are showing us some very interesting things about how we act. However, if we aren't careful, we can become a contemporary Brutus, laying our faults at the feet of evolution or genetics. The fact is that our criminal justice system and much of our thinking about morality and ethics is based on the idea that Bruce Wayne decided to become the lone vigilante named Batman. But did Bruce Wayne, because of his life experiences, choose to become Batman? Is that true? Which is more important, nature or nurture? There are some ugly things from the past that we need to consider when we start thinking about what we know about genetics and how genetics works. The early 20th century had an entire popular movement called eugenics. Eugenics. That is the selective human breeding to make what they called better babies. This was an idea of European origin, but it caught on and became very popular in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. Yes, religious fundamentalists of the time embraced eugenics, but the fact is that also progressive ministers and progressive organizations preached this doctrine. Liberal people practiced it. It was part and parcel of the early birth control movement, and of course, it eventually led to the atrocities of Nazi Germany. We remember the atrocities of Nazi Germany, but we don't remember so clearly or talk about the fact that those ideas were very widespread in the United States and in Western Europe in the 1920s. Yes, here in the US, people were eugenicists. It led to immigration laws that barred most people not of European origin from entering the United States. Also, it led to forced sterilization of thousands of people. Proponents believed that they could eradicate mental disorders through eugenics. They believed they could eradicate alcoholism, drug abuse by eugenics. And you may have seen the old-fashioned posters. If you look around a little bit and search on the internet, you will find a famous slogan from the day, quote, "Eugenics is the self-direction of evolution." Eugenics is the self-direction of evolution. That was the statement of the day, but the fact is, that is not the case. The eugenics movement led to a euthanasia society in the United States. Forced sterilization for those in mental institutions was a practice that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. And thousands of poor women in the United States were forcibly sterilized. The practice of requiring sterilization as a precondition for receiving welfare checks continued in some United States states up through the 1970s, and still today, once in a while, you hear a politician bringing it back up. The fact is, the Nazis got many of their ideas from the United States and used the example of the U.S. to justify their actions to the world community all through the 1920s. Today we know this behavior well as the rhetoric of neo-Nazis. It's still around, the Ku Klux Klan and some far right-wing politicians. But again, at one time, all across the political spectrum and the belief spectrums, people agreed with this movement. Now, I don't want to in any way justify the beliefs that led or resulted from eugenics. They are despicable. Yet, dismissing these ideas as something from the dark past is a very bad idea. Rather, we should look at that terrible chapter of American history as a cautionary tale, because besides being based on the most virulent forms of racism and ableism, political progressives also saw eugenics as good science, the latest in scientific knowledge. That is the cautionary tale. Eugenics appealed to the very people who were most open to the theory of natural selection or evolution. Why is the question. One reason so many people fell for it is that they applied the idea of natural selection, still not very well understood by most people in the early 20th century, to an idea that almost every American at the time did understand, and that was selective breeding of animals, the selective breeding of animals. Now, this is the reasoning that is based on a fallacy, but you see it all through the literature. Even former President Theodore Roosevelt was talking about it during the eugenics movement. Remember that poster that I mentioned from the time? Eugenics is the self-direction of evolution. Nowadays, most people who look at the matter know that natural selection cannot be self-selected. The time frame for natural selection to occur is too long for human beings to affect it, or even comprehend it for that matter. But most people did not understand that in the 1920s. Here's how the fatal error occurred. We have cats and dogs and rideable horses because of selective breeding. People figured this out a long time ago. It's how we have dogs and cats rather than wild cats and wolves. People began to slowly pick characteristics and selectively breed those animals. Most farmers in the early 20th century knew how to do this very well. They were experts in doing selective breeding. And remember that in the early 20th century, most Americans were farmers or had fairly, just within that generation, left the farm. So this was a widespread kind of knowledge. Nowadays, farmers who are trying to develop sustainable farms have to buy heirloom animals in the same way that they buy heirloom seeds, because the animals have been selectively bred nowadays to fit into a factory farming system. And if you aren't doing factory farming where everything is in huge warehouses essentially, and if you're going to go back to free-range chickens and free-range hogs and free-range cattle, you have to unselectively breed for those factory characteristics. People knew that traits can be affected in a short time among animals, and so they assumed that human genetics could be affected in that short time. And that simply is not true. Not in animals all that much, just small little things, and not in human beings at all. Of course, fruit flies are a very different story. And as is the famous case of the tube, the subway mice in London, that have evolved in about a century to and a half, 150 years, to have gray coats that exactly match the color of paint that is used at the bottom of London Underground tubes to paint below the tracks. They exactly match, so predators have a hard time seeing them. Moths have also been seen to do this in London because of the time frame. When the early Industrial Revolution began to occur, moths began to get grayer and grayer as the buildings got grayer and grayer from coal smoke that began to get all over the buildings in London. Then, when the reverse happened and coal stopped being used in London and people began to scrub the buildings off, then the moths become white again to match, again, the building. There's no eugenics committee that does this. This is a kind of natural selection. But people are not fruit flies or mice in the bottom of the London Underground. In addition, the mutations in the mice are very simple and they are quickly reversible. If the London Underground changed the color of paint to red tomorrow, all of those mice would be quickly found by predators and would quickly disappear. Scientific ideas can become dangerous when they're applied to culture or human life on a micro level, and this is what happened. Charles Darwin knew almost nothing about genetics, so the beginnings of the evolution theory have almost nothing to do with understandings in genetics. And also we need to remember that the DNA structure, that beautiful double helix that nowadays we can look up and look at pictures of, wasn't discovered until 1953. And we also have to remember that the first human genome published was in the year 2001. Also, figuring into the eugenics movement was the widespread racism and ableism of the early 20th century. Overt racism and ableist assumptions in the U.S. then led to the eugenics movement, and it permeated U.S. society in the 20s and 30s. From the outright segregationists to the progressives, just about everybody thought that eugenics was a good idea. There was even a homeopathy society that said that is, a kind of almost magical thinking concerning drug usage. Even they supported eugenics. But this isn't only a historical oddity. We see the same sort of misapplications of science in our own day, the misunderstandings. For example, despite what some New Age gurus might claim, people are not lonely because we live in an expanding universe. We can't walk through walls because there is lots and lots of space between atoms. And we don't vibrate with cosmic vibrations because of this thing called string theory. Those are all misapplications of scientific ideas, and also we cannot speed up natural selection through eugenics. The timescales are different. It's a misunderstanding of basic science. All these are the realm of hucksters, and in the case of eugenics, also racists and ableists. I think the takeaway here is this: when science appears to support our own prejudices, we'd better watch out, be careful. No, there isn't really a superhero who became Spider-Man because he was bitten by an irradiated spider. This is the purview of comic books and kind of sloppy thinking. As I said earlier, it's all well and good to dismiss the mistakes of the past and, oh, they were so long ago. But science continues to enter the popular mind and therefore the realm of laws and politics. And often science enters law and politics and popular thinking in the form of half-baked theories and misunderstandings of science. Here are some things that are real science that we forget, however. Let me go over some real science. Genetic research has taught us that the entire concept of race in human beings is a fiction. It's a mistake. There are no genetically identifiable races. Homo sapiens developed as a recognizable species along about 200,000 years ago, and some Homo sapiens began leaving Africa something around 80,000 years ago. 200,000 years, we became an identifiable species. 80,000 years ago, some Homo sapiens began to leave the African continent, right? Human generations are, let's call them 25-year spans, which means that some Homo sapiens left Africa 3,000 generations ago. And other Homo sapiens, such as the new immigrants from Somalia, left Africa only in this generation. But everybody alive in the entire world is actually an immigrant out of Africa. Despite what the racists of the early 20th century believed, there is no race in the Homo sapiens population, only the separation by time and cultural difference. This is the difference we see, actually, the separation by time and cultural difference. You may have read that President Obama, for example, is related to Harry Truman. He's also related to Dick Cheney and George Bush and Brad Pitt. This is not an urban legend. This is actually true, and it doesn't have anything to do with that 6 degrees of separation talked about with Kevin Bacon so much. It doesn't prove as much as you might think it proves, however, because all human beings are actually related to each other. The fact is, we don't notice people who aren't famous, and we like to sweep under the rugs those who are infamous and forget about them. So we notice if we have some relatives, even far off ones, who might have been famous or are famous now. But we're all related. Until everyone understands this, we will not only have egregious lunatics like the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, but also the casual cliches that still permeate our society and our culture and destroys the lives of too many people. Racist assumptions that are built in to the kind of understandings that we too often have. Today, genetic research has become a big business and the stuff of constant headlines. In most scientific debates, there's little or no emotion. Take, for example, is the universe expanding and how fast is it expanding? Or will it expand forever, or will it somehow collapse into a big crunch? That's much debated, but there's no name calling and there's no denial in that kind of science. With the nature-nurture argument, however, many of us feel as if we've got skin in that game. Those of us who are parents, for example, have invested lots and lots of effort and lots of money for our children, throwing it all on that roulette table and believing that nurture wins out over nature. As soon as one book comes out proving either nature or nurture is more important, then another one comes out which attacks the research done and the assumptions in the first book and tries to prove exactly the opposite. In my parenting, I know that sometimes I've felt like just throwing up my hands and saying, you know what, you're just like your grandparents. What was I even doing to affect their lives? They were just like their grandfather. The field of genetics holds some interesting possibilities, however. Through genotyping, we can discover whether a person has a low aggression variant of something called the MAOA gene. We may someday be able to predict who the killers among us will be. But what will we do with that information? That's the question. During the last Olympics, perhaps you read about Uzbekistan's Institute of Biogenic Chemistry. They will soon begin testing their nation's children concerning a gene called ACTN3. And that's a gene that codes for a protein found only in fast-twitch muscle fibers. Fast-twitch muscle fibers. If your ACTN number isn't just right, you will never be a fast athlete. So, it's key in some sports, but again, can we really test for that and predict in some way that this particular person will be a very good Olympic level athlete? What is the connection? It's not so easy to find the clear evidence that those little things that we call genes have some kind of direct hotline to human thought or behavior or even athletic abilities. We do well to remember that we share 44% of our genes with the fruit fly. 92% of our genes we share with those mutating mice in the underground in London. And we share slightly over 98% of our genes with our cousins, the chimpanzees, and sometimes they're smarter than us. And you know what? All the human variation that we see around us, all the things we see as human differences, that exists in 0.1% of our genetic makeup. So, how do we really differ so much? Genetics is fascinating. It's going to tell us a lot. But when science meets up with politics, you can find some dangerous things. I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis. It's been good talking with you.